So today I'm going to talk about Walter Mooney Hatch, a brilliant undergraduate at Oxford in the 1860s. He gained a fellowship at New College before embarking upon a career as a schoolmaster, and then became the rector of Birchanger, Essex. And there he died suddenly, aged just 33, in 1877, a few minutes after preaching the Advent Sunday sermon. This is a photograph in the archive of New College, Oxford, and that is Walter Hatch in the front row at the extreme end. His brother Edwin said of him, his intellect was essentially philosophical. He couldn't only analyze a theory, but frame one. He thought that education was based on a mischievous separation of intellectual from religious culture, and that the two might be blended into a perfect harmony, and that the chapel, rather than the hall or classroom, should be the centre of school life. Well, unfortunately, when he tried to put these ideas into practice by founding a school, he misjudged the market. And in 1875, he was forced into bankruptcy, and his New College fellowship had to be sequestered to pay off his debts. Even so, he continued to pursue his educational goals by working on a book that aimed to make Aristotle intelligible to a non-specialist reader, a book that would only see the light of day after his death. And that book is The Moral Philosophy of Aristotle, published in 1879. Now, in the 19th century at Oxford, they had a high regard for Aristotle as an important source of moral guidance, alongside Plato and the Bible. And the Nicomachean Ethics was taught as an education in moral character, and it was a compulsory part of the classics greats syllabus. But the problem with Aristotle is that he's too difficult to be readily understood. The obscurity of his writing means that only the most highly educated would be able to get the benefit of his thought. One prominent view in the scholastic world was that in religion, temple curtains are used for the purpose of preventing the impure from encountering things they are not worthy of meeting. And something rather similar was at work in the case of Aristotle. This was Aristotle's deliberate obscurity was functioning rather like the temple curtains. The purpose is to deter empty minds. Hatch recognized this problem, and his book, The Moral Philosophy of Aristotle, was intended to be the solution. If deliberate obfuscation was a genuine part of the Aristotelian tradition, Hatch saw himself as engaged in an attempt to reverse it. He did so by modifying the style in which Aristotle wrote, and by exercising what he calls metaphysical imagination, inserting missing links of thought, expanding hints, and bringing to light what lies beneath the surface. Well, this approach is very much at odds with modern Aristotelian scholarship. The attitude of modern Aristotelians is to say the obscurity is not a problem. In fact, it is our bread and butter. Fidelity to the meaning of the text is the guiding principle. Obscurity and ambiguity are to be explored rather than eliminated. So any reader has to then work extremely hard to juggle all sorts of interpretive problems and come away with a clear understanding from the text. Hatch was taking a creative line rather than being obsessed with questions of scholarship, and Hatch assumes that he has authority to do this. He's writing as someone with expertise that he's accumulated from studying both Aristotle and the very long Aristotelian tradition. And his conception of that tradition is seen through Christian spectacles. This fits in with his overall educational mission, which, as I said, was to harmonise intellectual and religious culture. Now, in a school setting, this meant that the school chapel, that is, God, was central to all educational activity. But in the context of the Nicomachean ethics of Aristotle, the harmonisation took the form of reading Aristotle in a Christian adjacent manner. Aristotle is a Christian friendly author. I'm now going to introduce you to Walter Hatch's work on Aristotle, and I'm going to take the very opening sentence of his translation of the Nicomachean Ethics. And the way to bring out the distinctive philosophy of Walter Hatch is to compare his imaginative translation with the translation that aims at semantic fidelity. And my example of that is the translation by the great Aristotelian scholar W.D. Ross as adapted or amended in 1984 by the equally great Aristotelian scholar, also from Oxford, Urmson. So their translation will appear in the first column, and then Hatch's translation is in the second column. And we're looking at the very opening sentence, a very famous sentence, by the way, of the Ethics of Aristotle. So this is Book 1, Chapter 1, and the Becker page is in red, and that's how you identify the passage of Aristotle you're talking about. And it's I would just point out, and this is absolutely typical of the Hatch project, the Becker pages are nowhere to be found. He's not interested in that level of scholarly helpfulness. So the opening sentence on the left: every art and every inquiry, and similarly every action and choice, is thought to aim at some good. And for this reason, the good has rightly been declared to be that at which all things aim. Then let's look at Hatch. So first of all, we get these headings and subheadings. So we get Roman numeral capital 1, Introduction. Is there a perfection of man, and how can it be attained? That is the theme of the opening pages in Hatch's view. Is there a perfection of man? And then a subheading, this is lowercase Roman numeral 1, arguments from design in nature in proof of human perfectibility. And then in bold, we begin with a side analysis, in which Hatch explains exactly what is going on in the Aristotle, according to Hatch, that is. There is design in all the works of nature and in all the activities of man. Now, let's look at the actual sentence. Every art and every step to knowledge, and similarly both every moral act and every decision of the will, seems to have some good or purpose at which it aims. The supreme good, therefore, or purpose of all things, is, as philosophers have well described it, that at which all things aim. Well, the key Christian idea, which, as you can see, is completely absent from the Ross Urmson version, is the idea of the supreme good. And Hatch takes the view that the supreme good is in fact the subject of the whole work. And he asks, what constitutes the perfection of man? What is that ideal towards the attainment of which all the powers and tendencies of our nature are directed? This actually appears in his analysis, which is published separately within the book. What is the perfect life? Hatch argues that the existence of the supreme good is proved by what he calls the analogy of nature. We see that things which lack intelligence, such as natural bodies, act for an end, and conclude from this that some intelligent being must exist to direct them, namely God. And this forces us to conclude not only that there is a supreme good, but that it ought to be attained. From a Christian perspective, our moral duties are thus conceived as duties to God. Now, that isn't in the translation, it's in the analysis which precedes it. So, I think you can see this is a glorious example of the great difference there is between Hatch and normal translators, if I can use the word normal. Hatch's approach has as its virtues the avoidance of the very things which characterize the modern academic approach, the normal approach. And how can we explain this? Well, his audience consisted of practical people. They didn't want to have to devote hours of philosophical analysis to extracting the point of the book. They were, if you like, the future administrators of the British Empire, very practical people. And it was an article of faith at Oxford University that the best training for these people was Aristotelian philosophy. And Hatch was a very earnest Christian, like a lot of Victorians. And he was enthusiastic to achieve moral improvement by teaching Aristotelian ethics. He wasn't trying to produce modern academic scholars. And that makes his creative approach easier to understand. There's a real sense of moral urgency, and that doesn't allow there to be a vacuum of interpretation in the ethics of Aristotle. As far as he was concerned, the work has a direct value in improving the moral character of young men, and that's why it should be taught. It's a vehicle for imparting good character to men destined for careers in the church or in politics or in the civil service. And it possessed both charm and good sense in the view of him and his fellow Aristotelians. And it's a powerful sense of conviction which helps us to understand why Hatch is a robust translator and dogmatic about what the text means in a way that is shocking, or would be shocking, if you tried it in a modern university seminar. While we may well think that this dogmatic and authoritarian reading of Aristotle is critically naive, the collapse of moral consensus in the course of the 20th century was profound, and this has meant that radically different points of view and presuppositions are now dominant in the background against which moral philosophy is conducted. The willingness of Hatch's contemporaries at Oxford to fall into line around his reading of Aristotle, and remember, when he died, two other people very quickly finished the work, even though there were still 4 books to go, seems completely remarkable. It just wouldn't happen today. The ready cooperation to finish the book and publish it within 2 years of his death is definitely very impressive. And the end result is a clear explanation of Aristotelian ethics, or a version of it. The important Aristotle for Walter Hatch is the Aristotle given by the ancient Christian tradition. Hatch gives us a very good impression of that tradition, and therefore that's a very good place for anyone interested in Aristotle to start.